The wrongfully accused man, the double chase, exotic locations, suave villains, how fight scenes are filmed, and of course, the MacGuffin. These are all tropes we see in spy movies that were pioneered by Alfred Hitchcock. Today, we're going to bring back Tony Lee Morale to help us decode Alfred Hitchcock's influence on spy movie tropes. He joined us on our May 27, 2022 podcast episode when we decoded Hitchcock's Notorious. Tony has published 4 books on Alfred Hitchcock, including his just released The Young Alfred Hitchcock's Movie-Making Masterclass. Hi, this is Dan.
And Tom.
From SpyMovieNavigator.com. And today, we want to welcome back to our show, Cracking the Code of Spy Movies, Tony Lee Morale. Welcome, Tony.
Hi, Dan and Tom. Great to be back on your podcast, especially to talk about one of my favorite genres, spy movies.
Yeah, we're very happy to have you back. And we're going to make sure that as we do this, we want people to understand what's in your new book. And again, your new book is The Young Alfred Hitchcock's Movie-Making Masterclass. So for anybody who's trying to write a new screenplay or direct a new screenplay and want to learn from a master, this book talks through Hitchcock's techniques, how he did things from start to finish in making a movie. So can you tell us a little bit about what's in it, who it's for, why you wrote it, and you have the word young in the title. So if you can kind of put that all together for us.
Sure. Well, it's a very special centenary this year. 2022 is a 100th year anniversary since Alfred Hitchcock directed his first movie. It was called Number 13. It was never released because it wasn't finished. But back when he was working for a studio, which was before Paramount, Famous Players Lasky in Islington in London, he was on the first rung of his ladder to become a major motion picture director. We've all got to start somewhere, and that's where he started. And I wrote it because I called it The Young. It's a revised edition of my Alfred Hitchcock's Movie-Making Masterclass book, but there's about 20% new content in it. And I skewed it very much towards content creators as well, because in today's world, as you know, because you do podcasts, there are a lot of content creators out there on Instagram, on TikTok, on podcasts, and it's much more easy these days for people to make content, whether it's a film, a podcast, a video, or short video. So there's an awful lot to learn from Hitchcock's films in writing a script, editing, music, directing, and marketing, all of which are essential for today's content creators.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, we know you're the Alfred Hitchcock aficionado. So we want to dive into some of your new book and specifically how Alfred Hitchcock's filmmaking techniques were used in some of his most famous spy movies, The 39 Steps, Secret Agent, The Man Who Knew Too Much, North by Northwest, and others. So that'd be great.
So, and we also want to examine how these techniques are used in other spy movies besides just Hitchcock. He pioneered a lot of these techniques, but let's talk also about where we might see them in other spy movies. So how did Hitchcock set the stage for how many spy movie tropes we're going to look at?
Yeah. I mean, we love the book. We read it. And we say up front that Hitchcock said, I'm a Puritan and believer in the visual. And that's what I think schools should teach. So often you hear of schools, he said, which send out a student with an 8mm camera and see what he observes. That's only part of it. As a director and Hitchcock fan, you say David Fincher says, he's playing with all of those things that make cinema fun and magic, the tricks of it. So let's talk about that. Tell us about the background of Hitchcock that you talk about up front in the book, his approach to coming up with ideas for movies, how you approached this book, and then let's get into Hitchcock's techniques and how they were used in some of his spy movies and espionage movies.
Well, he said it all began with a piece of paper. He loved the idea of a blank canvas. And of course, you need a hero, you need a villain. Those were the classic Hitchcock tropes in his spy movies especially. He loved the trope of a wrongfully accused man, which is a very important character in Hitchcock's films, and especially in his spy movies. But essentially, he thought it was very essential for the hero or the wrongfully accused man to have a goal. And that's good storytelling. So this character has to get from A to B, or has to prove A to B, or he's running from somewhere. And also the chase movies, obviously very important. in Hitchcock's films and spy movies. And if you think of a classic chase movie, I always think of The 39 Steps, which was one of his original films in 1935. And it really put Hitchcock on the map, not only in the UK, but also in America. It was a big hit, especially in New York and LA. And had a wonderful character actor, Robert Donat, as the wrongfully accused man. It had a great villain, the three and a half fingered man. And it had a duplicitous or blonde who was very difficult to get to know, but had fire under her ice with Madeleine Carroll. So all of those essential characters. You've got the wrongfully accused man. You've got the debonair villain who's often charming. And that's a whole character trope we can talk about in other spy movies. Because Hitchcock always said evil was seductive, evil was attractive. And so he wanted his villains to have shades of black and white and grey areas, not just be black and white, have a grey character who the audience might have sympathy for. In our last podcast, we, of course, spoke about Claude Rains, and there are many other characters like that in Hitchcock spy movies. And with a classic cool blonde who's very ladylike and composed when you first meet Madeleine Carroll in the train carriage, but she's slowly being unraveled and unruffled. And Hitchcock loved that, like taking his blondes and jumbling them around and seeing how they come out. So all of those ingredients. But to get back to the basics, it all started with an idea, and he loved the chase idea, secrets and spies. And when we spoke about on our last podcast, the MacGuffin, and just to briefly fill in the audience again, the MacGuffin is the object or the thing which the characters are chasing, but the audience don't really care about. It's the engine which drives the plot. So you often find that in spy movies. In the 39 Steps, the MacGuffin is actually a person. It's Mr. Memory, the fantastic character, because he's recited the memory to the secret formula of a silent aircraft engine. In Notorious, we talk about the uranium ore in the wine bottles. In Torn Curtain, the MacGuffin is a secret formula again to an anti-missile. So those are all things which drive the engine of a story. But with classic Hitchcock, classic spy movies, you're just enwrapped in the characters and see how they come out rather than being too concerned about the secrets which the spies are after.
Yeah.
Well, and we see with the MacGuffin, we see that in other spy movies as well. I mean, the big one here in Mission Impossible 3, the rabbit's foot. Yeah. If they're going for the rabbit's foot, who cares, right? Who cares what it is, right? They just something they have to go after there. So in Red Notice, they went after the 3 eggs. They were art objects, but it was really more the journey than what they were really going after that was important. So this concept of the MacGuffin is used quite often in current spy movies, but it all really had its beginning back with Hitchcock.
Yep.
That's correct. It's interesting you mentioned Mission Impossible, because John Woo, who did Mission Impossible 2, was a big Hitchcock fan. And I believe it was the formula, the viral formula.
Yeah, Bellerophon.
He actually modeled it on Notorious. So if you look at it, the relationship between Dougray Scott and Thandie Newton mirrors that of Ingrid Bergman and Claude Rains, with the Tom Cruise character being Cary Grant.
Very much so.
That's a good one. Good connection there.
Yeah. Now, in your book, you talk about the fact that Hitchcock liked espionage and the use of spies, but they weren't always. They might have been a wrongfully accused man, like you said, so they might be a civilian. They might be a government agent. So The Man Who Knew Too Much, the 39 Steps, Notorious, and North by Northwest are all examples of civilians thrust into spy roles, in some cases wrongly accused. But then you've got Secret Agent and Topaz, which these were government spies. Mm-hmm. And at Spy Movie Navigator, we tend to focus on the government spy, where Hitchcock actually splits this up pretty heavily in terms of his use. Let's drive into then what Hitchcock thought about spies. You had a comment in your book about what Hitchcock thought about spies. So can you tell us what that was?
He was very interested in the dichotomy. We see spies as villains, but he saw them as dichotomous. They're heroes in their own country. They may be villains in our country and vice versa. But again, it goes to not wanting just black and white characters. He was very interested in this ambiguity, moral ambiguity, and this grayness. And it's interesting what you were saying also about the wrongfully accused man, because he found it much more interesting if a wrongfully accused man wasn't a spy, but was an ordinary man thrown into unusual circumstances. He thought this extension for the audience would make them more relatable, whether it's Robert Donat, who's a visiting Canadian, Richard Hannay in the UK, in a foreign country for him, or if it's Ben McKenna, played by James Stewart, and his wife Jo, who are on holiday in Marrakesh in The Man Who Knew Too Much. And of course, the most classic one, which is modeled after the 39 Steps, is Cary Grant in North by Northwest as a slick advertising exec who's immediately recognized to be a spy, George Kaplan, a decoy spy, and it embarks on an extraordinary 2-hour adventure where he tries to wrongfully unaccuse himself.
Yeah, we see that Mission Impossible, of course, uses this trope in a little different twist with Ethan Hunt, because he is a government agent, but he's wrongly accused by Kittredge, and leads us to the double chase concept that we were talking about just a second ago, the double pursuit. And if you could just explain that in a sentence to people, because that's really a lot of what Hitchcock does here, really, is in the movies, in the spy movies especially, is this double pursuit concept of why this innocent person who is thought to be the bad guy cannot go to the police and is running from the people who are trying to get him, right? So it is like,
that's correct. Again, it's all to do with structure, one that Hitchcock was very interested. He had this great fear of the police. Again, the young Alfred Hitchcock's movie making masterclass. He famously tells the story at the age of 5. He was put in jail by his father for an infraction with a note. He was told to go to the local police station with a note saying, "This is what they do to naughty boys." And he was put in a cell for 5 minutes.
That's a true story, right?
Yeah. And so this gave him a lifelong fear of the police. So he was very interested in that.
Talk about a strict upbringing. Yeah. Wow.
Yes. And so the first chase is a wrongfully accused man trying to prove his innocence by running away from the police physically and mentally, whether it's Robert Donat running away from being thought the killer because he's just brought a woman home who herself is a spy, because she knows about the secret formula in Mr. Memory, and the three-fingered man. And he has to run away because he's assumed the killer. But then he's got a double chase because he's chasing his innocence. But then he's found to chase the Mr. Memory, or find out what the spies are after, chasing the MacGuffin. And similarly, Cary Grant goes on this wild goose chase on the 20th Century Limited train, and then to South Dakota to the prairie stop where he famously gets attacked by the biplane, and then ultimately to Mount Rushmore where he ends up in the villain's lair. Yeah. And that's another very interesting topic, the villain's lair. There's just been a great book come out called The Architecture of Alfred Hitchcock, and a classic villain trope is that these villains often have very slick pads, don't they? Modernist houses. They're very much on the cutting edge, whether it's Mission Impossible 2 on the Sydney waterfront, or the Frank Wright Lloyd's house in North by Northwest, which I go into a lot of detail in my book next year on storyboards, which is coming out.
Yeah, that's going to be a cool book too. We talked about that before.
He always does storyboards, so I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah, that's cool.
Right. So now you talk about the double chase and the and Dan, you mentioned that Ethan Hunt has the same type of thing in Mission Impossible. But now when we have the double chase, there's usually some kind of real chase, and that means that there's action in the movie. And action was very important to Hitchcock. And in your book, you talk about that and how he pioneered a lot of what we see in how action is filmed today versus how it had been being filmed when he started doing this. So spy movies use some of what he does. So can you talk a little bit about how Hitch looked at filming action, and especially like fight scenes and that kind of thing?
Sure. Well, with the action, again, the 39 Steps is very interesting. With my young Alfred Hitchcock, I was very keen to concentrate on the black and white period because that's where he started his tools and started all the tropes. So he described it as a continuation of little scenes. It's great for content creators today who make short films or videos. If you're on TikTok or Instagram, just looking at the structure of it, he called each a sequence like a little film onto itself. So if you watch Richard Hannay, Robert Donat, he goes onto the train and then he goes onto the Scottish moors. He goes to the farmhouse as a classic scene with Peggy Ashcroft, which is a very famous scene, and John Laurie and Robert Donat. And then he goes to the three-fingered man's house. And then he gets arrested. He has to escape from a police station. He immediately jumps into a marching band to disguise himself from the police. And then he ends up on an oratory platform. He's mistaken for a speaker. And that is just a lot of engine going. You know, this is Hitchcock and his writer working at Phil Pelt, but you need that in action movies to sustain the content. I'm sure we can think of many examples like the Bourne Identity series, for example, where it's constant action with the James Bond series, obviously, where they're going from location or from scene to scene to scene. And that obviously keeps the engine going and sustains the interest. And similarly, in The Man Who Knew Too Much with James Stewart, he's obviously starts in Marrakesh, and then he has to go on his own journey through London. Famously, he ends up at the wrong Ambrose Chapel because that's the name given to him. It turns out to be a place, not a man. And then famously ends up in the Albert Hall for that really famous sequence where the spies are looking to assassinate a visiting dignitary. Mm-hmm. And so I would say really look at the construction of these Hitchcocks for idea generation as well. And obviously that really, you can see many parallels in today's spy movies.
So you mentioned, Tony, the Man Who Knew Too Much, and that's the only Hitchcock movie he remade, right? He had the 1934, 1956 version, right?
That's right.
And we have a podcast episode out on those movies as well, decoding them both in the same podcast. And talk about how, in that particular example, how Hitchcock presents suspense versus mystery, or I think you use another word for it. And there's a difference between creation of suspense and just the mystery that's surrounding.
I think mystique might have been the other word.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, The Man Who Knew Too Much is a great quote. In 1934, he made it before the 39 Steps. He said it was made by a talented amateur, a talented director. But the remake, he said, was made by a professional by 1956 because he had all the Hollywood tools at his disposal then, and obviously big stars with James Stewart and Doris Day. But the premise is very much the same, and certainly the climax at the Albert Hall. I mean, this is a great use of suspense and also cross-cutting, just to get into technical film language, and the use of shot length as well. Because in the 1956 version, Joe McKenna, Doris Day, who's really, really good in The Man Who Knew Too Much, really underrated in many films, but really shines in The Man Who Knew Too Much. She's a mother whose child has been kidnapped. So there's a lot depending on her for this. And she's got this moral ambiguity conflict here because this stranger she knows is going to be assassinated, but at the same time, her son is being kidnapped by the very perpetrators. So does she scream out and warn? And so there's great suspense. And Hitchcock said suspense is an emotional process, whereas mystery is like a whodunit. But suspense really involves the audience. You know, is Doris Day going to scream out? Is she going to save this man's life, or is she going to be silent? So you really feel that moral ambiguity, and Hitchcock cuts from the orchestra to Doris Day, to the gun famously peeking through the curtain at the dignitary. And so the suspense is ratcheted 100 miles with Bernard Herrmann's music as well. But the key to it is we know the precise moment that the gunshot is going to fire, because Hitchcock said it's very important with all suspense to give the audience information. So we know the point in the record where the gunfire is going to be made. He said there's no point having anxieties if the audience have nothing to be anxious about. And he gave a very, very famous example of the bomb under the table. And so if you have a bomb under the table and you know it's going to go off in 5 minutes, that's 5 minutes of suspense. But if it suddenly goes off, that's no suspense, that's surprise or shock if you don't tell the audience. And I'm sure we can find many parallels in spy movies of suspense where they've given the audience information for that.
Yeah, and by doing that, you're involving the audience in the movie. You're really creating the suspense in the viewer's mind, and as opposed to just watching something unfold.
Well, and
which is the mystery, the magic of Hitchcock.
Yeah, and if you take a look at like Goldfinger, the whole thing about when you got the countdown counter going for the nuke device to blow up inside of Fort Knox, it's very similar to this concept of everybody knows that this bomb's going to go off or there's going to be a shooting in The Man Who Knew Too Much. But in Goldfinger, you see this countdown. It's like, can we stop it?
Yeah.
Because James Bond has to stop that one. And here with the shooting, it's like, are we going to be able to stop the shooting, or what can we do here? So it's similar concept.
What was his quote? He said something about there's no suspense in a bomb going off. The suspense is in anticipating it, or something like that, right? It's like anticipating it going off. Yep. There's where you're involved, thinking, what's going to happen next? All right, cool.
So as we're talking about The Man Who Knew Too Much here, why don't we keep going a little bit, because it brings us another thing that Hitchcock liked to inject into his movies that we really see in James Bond, and that's humor, right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned in this the Man Who Knew Too Much in the book, you talk about the whole taxidermy scene and how you mentioned it as part of action, but it's also a humorous thing that gets added there.
There are comedic elements in Hitchcock, which, generally you're thinking, this is not going to be funny, when you think of Hitchcock movies. But, right, Tony? He does, like Tom's saying, he injects this humor in places strategically.
He does, and that's why I love the 39 Steps. I think it's a very humorous film. I mean, just the notion of Robert Donat and Madeleine Carroll being handcuffed together and like scrambling across the Scottish moors and ending up in an inn and having to spend the night together. It's quite risque for 1935. Yeah. And there's that great shot of her taking off her stockings with one hand while still being handcuffed to Robert Donat. So he had a great sense of humor. He loved practical jokes. There's a very famous story attached to that he so that Robert Donat and Madeleine Carroll got to know each other. That scene, the handcuffs, was filmed on the first day of shooting, and so they spent a lot of time together. And he famously lost the key to the handcuffs as a practical joke. One of the biographers goes a bit far in insinuating it was on purpose, and they spent hours together. I think it was just for a short time.
Well, keys are important to Hitchcock, right?
Yes.
Notorious. You've got that shot going to the key. Now, I want to go back to another shot type, because when we talked earlier about action, and if we take action and then inject the fight into that, the technique that Hitchcock uses in Psycho by using a montage to show the killing, and if you think about the fights that we see now, we're in pre-Hitchcock, when you saw a fight, it was pretty much the camera was in the room and people were fighting. And now we've got almost a montage for every fight that you see in a spy movie of, okay, here's an arm going here, here's this going. It's not just we're sitting back and watching them fight. And really, I think it comes based out of the work Hitchcock did starting with Psycho, maybe before then, but Psycho's the one that comes to mind for me.
Absolutely. And another one, I don't know, I remember we discussed it last time. I don't know if you had a chance to watch it, but Torn Curtain. Torn Curtain is a very famous Hitchcock movie when we're talking about fight scenes,
Right.
because again, we have a spy, a double agent in the Paul Newman character who is pretending to defect over to the Iron Curtain to East Germany to find out from the professor at Ludwig University about an anti-missile formula. And so he's part of a secret organization called Pi, as in pi in the Greek alphabet. Mm-hmm. And he goes to a farmhouse and he's followed by this great actor who plays Gromak, who's part of the surveillance or agency in East Berlin. And because the taxi driver is waiting outside for Paul Newman and he can't hear him disposing of the threat, Paul Newman has to kill Gromak with just the tools in the kitchen. And this was Hitchcock was very good at. He was saying, always use your location to the fullest. So if you're in a kitchen, how are you going to kill someone if you don't have a gun? Well, you've got a shovel, you've got a gas oven, you've got crockery, you've got pots and pans, you've got a knife. So he was a big believer of using the backdrop to its fullest. And again, later on, there's a great sequence in Torn Curtain when he has to escape from the Germans again, when we're in an opera and Julie Andrews and Paul Newman are sitting in the middle of an opera, and Paul Newman is surrounded and he has a brainwave to shout fire. So the whole theatre erupts in pandemonium. Another classic example is in North by Northwest, the famous auction scene. So Cary Grant similarly is surrounded by the two heavies. How is he going to get out? He starts crazily bidding 2,000. 50p, you know,
that's a great scene.
Famous, great scene. And that's such a clever use of location between Hitchcock and his screenwriter Ernest Lehman to get the character out of that situation.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great point. And I think a lot of us would overlook that watching the Hitchcock movies. We just assume this is all flowing along. But to know that secret now and watch these movies, how he uses location to maximize the locations, it's pretty deep. That's pretty interesting stuff. That's good stuff. All right. He also has this tendency sometimes to kill off a star actor somewhat early in the movie, right? And we've seen examples of this like in Psycho and so on. And so why did he do that? And what are some of there's other modern, I'm sure, spy movies that have used this kind of action as well. Like maybe Mission Impossible comes to mind and so on. What was he thinking?
Well, if you have a big star like Janet Leigh in Psycho, she was a bigger star from Vera Miles at the time, or John Gavin, or Anthony Perkins. She was a marquee star in 1959. She was heavily promoted in the posters, often wearing just her brassiere, famously, an ordinary working girl's brassiere. And so people identified with her, and they never think she'd die 40 minutes into the movie. But Hitchcock was so clever at doing that. He gave the lead actress the part, and so the audience were just stunned after that. And then anything could happen. Where's his direction going to go after you kill off your main star? And so the audience sympathies transfer to the killer, which was classic Hitchcock ambiguity again. So we latch on to Anthony Perkins' character Norman Bates because he's the only other identifiable case. And so we see this as well in other spy movies. You mentioned Mission Impossible. In the 1996 version, obviously Kristen Scott Thomas dies in the first scenes of the movie, and as well as the other stars. And so Tom Cruise has just lost his whole platoon. And so what's going to happen next? So again, we attach ourselves to the Tom Cruise character for the rest of the movie. And Steven Soderbergh was a big Hitchcock fan. He did the same with the virus thriller Contagion. He killed off a lot of big stars, Gwyneth Paltrow, Kate Winslet early on in the film. And again, it's just to create this really unsettling unease. And so the audience are on their toes. Anything can happen. Anyone could be killed off at any minute.
Yeah. That does surprise you. Certainly in Psycho it does. And so Hitchcock creates this sense in the viewer then that, like you said, that what's going to happen next if this happened already. So that's pretty compelling and draws you in. I mean, some of the James Bond stuff now we see some of the main stars get killed at the end of the movie, like in Skyfall with M, and of course No Time to Die. We see a couple of characters getting killed. But that's an interesting little twist on Hitch. So he always had a purpose. Whatever he's doing, there's no fluff in his movies. Every scene, whether you were talking about like the camera angles, the length of the camera shot, sometimes I think it is something very important to pay attention to, and what he's trying to do with that kind of thing. Maybe talk a little bit about that before we go into the next set. The camera stuff in Hitchcock movies, whether they're long shots like we see in Notorious and The Key, or other shots, it's tremendous work and draws the audience into the movies. So if you could talk about the different kinds of things. I know we talked about the montage kind of thing and the moving from one scene to another scene, but if you could talk about the camera stuff just for a second and how this worked into these spy movie stuff.
Sure. So in the 39 Steps, there's a very famous match cut or match shot. So after the landlady has discovered the body of the spy who's killed in Richard Hannay's flat in London, Hitchcock cuts from her scream to the scream of the engine, the train engine. It's just a great kind of match cut going from a close-up of a woman screaming to the train whistle screaming. That's a very famous shot.
Yeah, that's a great one. Great one.
And another very famous or very good use of a camera. Hitchcock loved forms of transport. One of his favorite modes of transport was train travel. And again, we've seen so many spy movies on trains and fights on trains, whether it's James Bond or Jason Bourne, or even the new film. I don't know if you've seen it, called Bullet, which is with
the Bullet Train. Yeah,
right. with Brad Pitt.
Yep.
And so that again all started with Hitchcock's love of trains, especially with 39 Steps. And he kept the camera inside the train when he showed establishing shots. So if you look at it carefully, and in North by Northwest, he never left the train to do what he called unnecessary establishers. It would be a cow's point of view if you saw the train just going across the field. You take the audience out of the moment. So he kept the camera inside the train, and he would just move it slightly, just out of the window to see the curve of a train as it goes into a tunnel or goes through scenery. And so that intimate closure, you both get your establishing shots, but you keep the audience inside with the characters. And that was really important, the geography of a camera. Or his most famous trademark shot was a forward point of view tracking shot, where the camera assumes the point of view of a character and moves forward, whether it's going to discover something suspenseful, or whether it's going to pick up a key, or if a character is going to pick up some money, or the camera sees something. Again, in James Stewart in Rear Window is a very famous example of this, but many other examples of those Hitchcock point of view shots.
Yeah, and all of that, these techniques that he used, which we just watch and assume, that draws the audience into the scene and into the movie more than, like you're saying, a long shot or whatever. So, I mean, that's just tremendous stuff that we just take for granted watching the movie. But when you think about it for a second, like we're doing now, it's like, well, that's just fabulous stuff.
Well,
That's
and you have a great description in the book about the vertigo shot and how he had thought about it years earlier and couldn't quite figure out how to do it. And then when he made Vertigo, I don't want to give it away, right? Read the book. It's in there, and it's really well described. Now, you also were talking there just about the action staying inside the train. So we saw that in The Lady Vanishes, The 39 Steps, and North by Northwest. James Bond in From Russia with Love, all the action stays in the train when they're doing the train stuff. But then it's like people didn't listen to what Hitchcock was doing, and in Mission Impossible in Octopussy and Skyfall, we see action outside the train. People on top of the train, people, if you ever saw Silver Streak, they kept getting, the one guy keeps getting, Gene Wilder's character keeps getting thrown off the train and he's trying to figure out how to get back on. Do you think that this action on the train helps, or the fact that, Hitch liked to keep everything inside, was that more intimate and is that more suspenseful?
I think so. Also, a changing product of the time, because Hitchcock famously loved studio filming. He didn't like location filming just because there are so many uncontrollable factors, especially the weather and the lighting. So on a practical level, but he was very good at characterization and drama and suspense and intimacy. And if you look at something like Murder on the Orient Express, he never wanted to do an Agatha Christie, because he thought that was just mystery, a whodunit. He didn't think it was suspenseful. But I don't know if you saw the Kenneth Branagh's remake,
Mm-hmm.
but he did some very unusual angles in that.
Yeah.
I would have loved to have seen Hitchcock direct a Hercule Poirot, even though he wasn't interested, because they are almost chamber pieces, aren't they, in their intimacy? They're just two people talking as a detective is figuring out or interrogating the victims. But I think Hitchcock just took it to another level. I mean, I do love those films. Skyfall is one of my favorite James Bonds, actually. I think it's just everything's working in terms of a characterization and the plot. And so those kind of grand suspense scenes, they just weren't at his disposal, really, in the 1930s. If you look at the 39 Steps, it's on the Scottish moors, but much of it is actually on a soundstage. And it doesn't matter, because you're so invested in Robert Donat and Madeleine Carroll. He was so good at casting those two actors. You're just really caught in their mini chamber drama as they're pulling each other through the Scottish moors.
Yeah. Now they did some on location stuff, right? The Man Who Knew Too Much, 1934, Switzerland. They did a lot of that in Switzerland, right? And
that's right. They filmed some of the scenes in St. Moritz, because Hitchcock and Alma went on honeymoon there, and they famously returned every Christmas. They loved it so much in that part of Switzerland. But a lot of the Man Who Knew Too Much is miniatures. So if you look at, and it doesn't really matter in black and white, because again, that's just part of its endearing appeal. And Hitchcock loved using the techniques at the time. And you've always got to relate it to the time it was made, like 1962. When we look at the birds, we might laugh at the special effects to see through them, but they were very pioneering at the time.
Yeah, the lady vanishes too. The sets, the little model sets and stuff.
Well, I just saw watched the birds the other day, and it was like, man, that really is good.
It is.
So it's interesting, because you had made the comment that he likes to do a lot of the filming on set. Yet some of the places he took us to, in terms of Switzerland and Morocco, I think kind of set the stage for what we see in many spy movies, where they're going all over the world.
That's right.
And I think that Hitch kind of helped set that stage with some of this.
Especially in the 1950s with VistaVision, because at the time, if you recall, cinema was really fighting the advent of television. So it was trying to attract audiences. And so one way to do that was to go on foreign locations, and you've got VistaVision widescreen. And so it'd be very glamorous to go to Marrakesh with James Stewart and Doris Day. It'd be very glamorous to go to London with that movie as well. In Topaz, which was made in 1969, they didn't go to Cuba because they weren't allowed, but they filmed in Florida as the substitute of the Cuba, and brought in palm trees. I interviewed Karen Dorr, the actress, and she told me about that story. And they went to Paris, and they went to Copenhagen. So that globe-trotting appeal was a way to bring in audiences to the cinema, obviously, to get people away from television. And obviously the James Bond films and all the spy movies replicate that. Recently saw the Jurassic Park 4, and that similarly follows a similar globe-trotting idea. So obviously the locations, and if you look at other spy movies made during that time, From Russia with Love, Charade in 1963, which was a Donen film with Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn. Again, that globe-trotting appeal.
Yeah, especially in the 50s and early 60s when people were not traveling like they travel now. This brought them to locations they could probably never see in their lives. So that was kind of cool. In Foreign Correspondent, did they actually do anything in Holland with the windmills, or was that all set?
I believe it was miniatures, and that's a very famous example of using the location or using the props, because the windmill are turning in the wrong direction, which is a signal for the spies. But it's a great use of character location.
Yeah. Okay. That's fun.
Okay. While we're talking about locations, you also talk in the book about how Hitchcock liked to shoot inside of houses and let you see what people do in houses. And you gave an example from Vertigo.
Well, Vertigo obviously set in San Francisco, but I go into detail a lot in my storyboard book next year, because the design, he was very keen to characterize people's homes. So when you're in Scotty's apartment in Vertigo, or Midge's apartment, or Gavin Elster, who's the villain of the piece, when we see him in this beautiful library, and he's a shipping magnate, beautiful oak rich furniture, it immediately sets the stage for the character. And so famously, there's a production designer for Vertigo, Henry Bumstead, who knew to give these characters tropes. So if you look carefully in Vertigo's, James Stewart's character is a policeman. He wouldn't read much. So originally he filled the room with books, and Bummy, his name was Henry Bumstead, Bummy was told, "Oh, is this a learned man?" And no, he's not a learned man. He wouldn't have time to read books. So he made James Stewart's character a stamp collector. He thought he'd be more keeping. So if you look closely, it's there in the background on one of his bureaus, the stamp collecting set. And so it's giving those details, obviously, to the heroes and villains of the piece. And what we spoke earlier about the famous Frank Lloyd Wright house, it's a modernist house. It's designed after a very famous house from a designer, Falling Water. Mm-hmm. And so it's all glass minimalism. Glass was very important, so Cary Grant could see Eva Mary Saint in the top bedroom, and he knows he has to get to her, and he throws the matchbook down to her. The geography is superb. And when he says "they're on to you," and she looks up and has to go back to her room. So he really thought about the geography of the house and the use of props and tools. And even when Cary Grant crosses the landing, he's spotted by the housekeeper in the TV set in the reflection. Yes. So it's all carefully choreographed. Yes.
And again, the camera angles there too were terrific, with the balcony scene and the matches, and terrific stuff. So
and seeing the stamp collection in Vertigo brings me to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, right? Because there's a scene when James Bond goes into M's house. Yes. And M is working on his, and I'm going to get this word wrong again, lepidoptery. I think I actually got it that time. Which is butterfly collecting. And so to me, when I was reading what you were saying about the stamp collecting in Vertigo, I instantly was drawn to what they did in On Her Majesty's Secret Service with the butterfly collecting. I'm not going to attempt trying to say that word twice.
All right, let's move on to one of my favorite things in the Hitchcock movies that he added, that I think to spy movies that we see forever now: the suave, charming, or sympathetic villain. All right, one of my favorite all-time villains is Franz Sanchez in License to Kill. He's played by Robert Davi, and we actually interviewed Robert Davi, spent an hour and a half with him yesterday, and a lot of fun. He was a great guy. And then we got Kamal Khan, Max Zorin, Elliot Carver, and others from James Bond movies as well. Maybe Major Dolby and Colonel Stock, which we love from Funeral in Berlin, Harry Palmer movies. So how did Hitchcock do this? Why did Hitchcock do this? And why did he like this approach to villains? And what are some examples?
Sure. It goes back to what I said earlier. He loved grey. gray characters. Black and white is boring, you know. He said he wanted to avoid the cliche all the time, like the villain with a twirling moustache or the black cat down the alley. And so again, right back to the 39 Steps, you have Godfrey Turle as a three-fingered man living in this beautiful mansion, very, very debonair. You've got James Mason living in that lovely house in North by Northwest.
Yes.
You've got Ray Milland in Dial for Murder, who's a very suave and sophisticated murderer with his wife, Grace Kelly, who he tries to murder. A very famous Hitchcock film is Shadow of a Doubt. And so you had Joseph Cotton as the mysterious Uncle Charlie, who infiltrates the family again and has a big impression on niece Charlie. And so he wanted to give, he said, evil is seductive. How could a murderer or a villain get close to his victims if he wasn't charming, wasn't seductive? Famously, Robert Walker in Strangers on a Train, who's very, very kind of suave and talkative, or the Joseph Cotton character in Shadow of a Doubt, who's actually the merry widow murderer, and so he can get close to his victims. And so it was just a way, again, avoiding the cliche. There's also the Bob Rust character in Frenzy, and even somewhat Anthony Perkins in Psycho, because he comes across very much as a boy next door in that heart-to-heart chat with Janet Leigh just before he murders her in the shower. Yeah. And so I think that was a very underlining reason, and you can really see that in a lot of spy movies. But there's a real trope especially in the James Bond, to give a villain a scar or some facial disfigurement, like in Spectre or even Skyfall with Javier Bardem. But I actually think Javier Bardem's a great villain because he oozes charisma and charm. There's not one person in the audience who leaves Skyfall without having a Javier Bardem big impression. Again, that's great casting of the actor. But again, unfortunately, I think facial deformity, going right back to Jaws in Moonraker and The Spy Who Loved Me, is a classic James Bond trope. But again, there are villains, and I'm sure who are very attractive and charming, like Scaramanga or those kind of villains in the James Bond films.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, even Goldfinger tries to have a little class with how he does things.
Yeah,
he's just
he's a charming guy.
Yeah.
What about Claude Rains here in Alex Sebastian and Notorious? I mean, you almost are on his side. You feel so bad for him.
You do feel bad for him. He got totally played.
Yeah, on both sides.
Yeah. Now let's jump back to your book, The Young Alfred Hitchcock's Movie Making Masterclass. And the way you have this, and I want to talk about the structure of the book a little bit here, instead of just talking about how Hitchcock worked. Let's talk about how your book works a little bit, because you've set this thing up for the new writer or the director to go through the process of making a movie the way Hitch did it. And you start out with coming up with a story, writing the screenplay, pre-production, working with actors, using the camera to get the audience to see the story, editing and sound, which we really haven't talked about today, and then finally getting the movie out and publicity and stuff like that. So why did you structure it in that format?
I think that's the idea. That's a kind of progression way to do filmmaking or content creating. As we said at the beginning of the podcast, you have an idea, that blank piece of paper, and then you've got to write a story. And Hitchcock was very detailed about pre-production and pre-planning. So alongside the scriptwriter, he would often commission a storyboard artist to do key scenes for him. And then you've got your pre-production, and then you start filming, or you start your audio work, and then the post-production. So it was really just a logical progression to make content these days. I mean, there may be different ways to do it now, but most of the time you start with an idea. And he famously said, the script are the three most important things in filmmaking.
It's like real estate. Location. All right. You have a section in your book, Tony, called Give Your Audience Information. So let's talk about that for a second, because as we're watching movies, we don't think about stuff like that. We're just watching the movie and absorbing it, enjoying it or not enjoying a movie. But here you have a whole section dedicated to give your audience information, which was one of Hitchcock's things. Can you explain that a little bit and how that works?
Sure. It goes back to the idea of suspense. You've got to give the audience information to be suspenseful. He often quoted his 1936 film Sabotage, when the bomb goes off from a bus and kills a little boy and his dog. And that was a mistake, killing a boy to begin with. But he didn't give enough information. It goes to the story of the bomb under the table. If it suddenly goes off, that's shock. That's not suspense. But if you tell the audience there's a bomb under this table, you're going to get 5 minutes worth of suspense. And one of the most famous suspenseful scenes, obviously, is the prairie stop in North by Northwest.
Yes.
And so we know Cary Grant is being sent there by Eva Mary Saint, and we know that she's not up to no good. We don't know she's a double agent yet, but we've seen that note delivered to James Mason in the neighboring car carriage saying, "What do I do with him in the morning?" So we know that she's on the phone. We don't know that she's on the phone to Leonard, the henchman, as yet, but we know something's not right. And so there's that really sinister line, which the man waiting at the bus stop says to Cary Grant, "That's funny. There's a plane dusting crops where there ain't no crops." And so, that sends shivers down your spine. And so we see out of the blue this biplane come and attacks Cary Grant in a very suspenseful 9-minute sequence. And a lot of it is no dialogue, which is masterful. Again, this harks back to the young Alfred Hitchcock's use of silent film. He started off on silent films, obviously. And famously, the crop duster attack is emulated in From Russia with Love, and many other Hitchcock films since then. I can think of also The Spy Who Loved Me. I think there was another helicopter attack there against the underwater car. And so, yes, but it's just a great way to involve the audience if you give them that information so they're on the edge of their seats.
Yeah, I think, like we said before, this is what draws you in. And really, you're watching the movie, you're not paying attention. You're not thinking that, wow, this is masterful directing. You're just like, you're sucked into the movie and you think, I love this. And you don't know why. Now we know why. That's good.
Okay, so we've talked about the structure of the book a little bit here, and you've told some of the stories that are in the book. But as I said before, there's a lot in this book, and we don't want to give it all away here. Listening to this podcast episode should not be your end all on this, because there's a lot in this book that I really, really enjoyed it.
Really fun read.
And I like the way that you use the questions at the end of the chapter. You're calling this a masterclass. It kind of has a school book feel to it with that kind of stuff that the student who's taking the masterclass should be able to learn well by completing those sections at the end. So I thought that was really well done.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, Tony, we loved reading your book. We really enjoyed it. It's masterful in its own right and brings out so many nuances of the Hitchcock films that I think people are going to enjoy reading. So if people want to order this book or any of your books, what should they do?
The easiest place is on Amazon to get the new book, The Young Alfred Hitchcock. It's on a discount price. It's only $14.99 for a paperback or $2.99 for Kindle.
Oh, great.
And so I'm very, very proud of the cover. That's Hitchcock on the set of Shadow of a Doubt in 1942, taken by a famous photographer. And there's more of him on the back cover as well. And so it just really epitomizes, again, the youthfulness. He said he was very much aimed at the young people, despite, he said, when people say I'm 70, that's a damn lie. I'm twice 35, that's all, twice 35. And so he always had that youthful exuberance, which, as we've discussed in his films.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So everyone, be sure to check out this book and Tony's other books. Just search Tony Lee Morrell, that's Moral, on Amazon, and you will find them all. Well, we'd like to thank you, Tony, for joining us again, and we wish you all the best with your new book. It was fantastic. We really enjoyed reading it. Thank you again. We'd love to have you back.
I'd love to come back. Thank you.
All right. Well, that's a wrap. This has been Dan
And Tom.
from SpyMovieNavigator.com. Please subscribe to our show, Cracking the Code of Spy Movies, through your favorite podcast app. That helps us do more episodes. Thanks for listening. We appreciate it.